Imagine a society where the nation's leader answers to no earthly authority. No voters, no judges, no legislature. Only God. In 1649, the people of England took the man holding that exact authority, dragged him into a courtroom, and put him on trial. They found King Charles I guilty of treason, and in front of a massive crowd, they cut off his head. How does a society that genuinely believed its king was chosen by heaven reach the point of executing him? The axe fell at the end of a long, calculated collapse of trust. This was the inevitable result of decades of broken promises, religious paranoia, and a king who refused to compromise. Charles I operated on a foundational belief, the divine right of kings. In his mind, his power was handed down directly from God, making his decisions completely beyond the reach of his subjects. But a rising political force known as Parliament had a different idea. They wanted a voice in governance and to place clear boundaries on the king's authority. Charles refused. In 1629, he dismissed Parliament, sent the members home, and ruled England alone for 11 years. Ruling alone was expensive. Charles needed to fund his court and pay for military campaigns, but under English law, he lacked the authority to raise taxes without Parliament's approval. He found a loophole in an old tax called ship money, normally collected only from coastal towns during wartime to pay for the navy. Charles forced the entire inland country to pay it during years of peace. People were furious. By bypassing the law to reach into their pockets, Charles transformed himself into a predator in the eyes of his subjects, using his office to extract wealth rather than protect it. While he was emptying their wallets, he was also threatening their faith. England was Protestant, but Charles began imposing strict, highly ritualized religious practices that looked dangerously Catholic to a deeply suspicious public. He tried to force these same rules onto Scotland. The Scots immediately rebelled, leaving Charles with a war he couldn't afford. Desperate for cash to raise an army, Charles had to recall Parliament in 1640, but they refused to hand over money without sweeping reforms that would strip him of his absolute control. The standoff ended in violence in 1642. Charles marched into the House of Commons with armed soldiers, attempting to arrest his loudest critics by force. He failed to capture them, but the damage was done. Any remaining trust vanished, and England descended into a brutal civil war. The fighting dragged on until Parliament created a highly disciplined fighting force called the New Model Army. By 1646, they had completely crushed the king's forces. Even after winning a war and taking their king prisoner, the nation still hesitated. Most people wanted a functional power-sharing agreement, not a dead monarch. Charles, however, viewed any compromise as a sin against God. Instead of negotiating a peace treaty, he secretly sent letters behind Parliament's back, trying to play his enemies against one another. He eventually convinced foreign and domestic allies to take up arms once again, plunging an exhausted, bleeding country into a second civil war in 1648. The army and political leaders surveyed the new waves of destruction and reached a grim conclusion. As long as Charles remained alive, England would never know peace. This led to a radical, historic decision, putting a reigning king on trial for high treason against his own people. Charles refused to even enter a plea. He sat in the courtroom and argued that no earthly authority had the legal standing to judge a divinely appointed monarch. He stubbornly rejected the reality in front of him. With no other way to secure the safety of the nation, the court issued a guilty verdict and a sentence of death. On January 30th, 1649, Charles walked out onto a wooden scaffold built right up against the banqueting house in London. The massive crowd watched the scaffold in dead, breathless silence. And then, with a single strike, the axe fell. The shockwave was immediate. The monarchy was abolished, and England began a new chapter as a republic known as the Commonwealth. Killing the king was the desperate conclusion of a decade of failed compromises. Charles refused to adapt to a world where his authority had limits, and in the end, the crown he claimed as a divine right cost him his life.